Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. I'm going to begin with a short reading. This is from the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. The nature of mind. That which is commonly called mind is of intuitive wisdom. Although the one mind is, it has no existence. Being the source of all the bliss of nirvana and of all the sorrow of samsara, it is cherished like the 11 yanas. The various names given to it are innumerable. Some call it the mental self. Certain heretics call it the ego. By the Hinayanas it is called the essentiality of doctrines. By the Yogacara it is called wisdom. Some call it the means of attaining the other shore of wisdom. Some call it the Buddha essence. Some call it the great symbol. Some call it the soul seed. Some call it the potentiality of truth. Some call it the all foundation. Other names in ordinary language are also given to it. If one knows how to apply in a threefold manner this knowing of the mind, all past knowledge lost to memory becomes perfectly clear, and also knowledge of the future, thought of as unborn and unconceived. In the present, when the mind remains as it is naturally, it is ordinarily comprehended by its own time. When one seeks one's mind in its true state, it is found to be quite intelligible, although invisible. In its true state, mind is naked, immaculate, not made of anything, being of the voidness, clear, vacuous, without duality, transparent, timeless, uncompounded, unimpeded, colorless, not realizable as a separate thing, but as the unity of all things, yet not composed of them, of one taste, and transcendent over differentiation. Nor is one's own mind separable from other minds. To realize the quintessential being of the one mind is to realize the immutable at-one-ment of the Trikaya. The mind being as the uncreated and of the voidness, the Dharmakaya, and as the vacuous and self-radiant, the Sambhogakaya, and as the unobscured shining for all living creatures, the Nirmanakaya, is the primordial essence, wherein its three divine aspects are one. If the yogic application of this wisdom be thorough, one will comprehend that which has just been set forth above. Mind in its true nature, being non-created and self-radiant, how can one, without knowing the mind, assert that mind is created? There being in this yoga nothing objective about which to meditate, how can one, without having ascertained the true nature of mind by meditation, assert that the mind is created? Mind in its true state being reality, how can one, without having discovered one's own mind, assert that mind is created? Mind in its true state being undoubtedly ever existing, how can one, without having seen the mind face to face, assert that mind is created? The thinking principle being of the very essence of mind, how can one, without having sought and found it, assert that mind is created? Mind being transcendent over creation and thus partaking of the uncreated, how can one assert that mind is created? Mind being in its primordial, unmodified naturalness, non-created, as it should be taken to be, and without form, how can one assert that it is created? Inasmuch as mind can also be taken to be devoid of quality, how can one venture to assert that it is created? The self-born, qualityless mind being like the three voids, undifferentiated, unmodified, how can one assert that mind is created? Mind being without objectivity and causation, self-originated, self-born, how can one, without having endeavored to know mind, assert that mind is created? Inasmuch as divine wisdom dawns in accordance with its own time, and one is emancipated, how can opponents of these teachings assert that it is created? Mind being as it is, of this nature, and thus unknowable, how can one assert that it is created? The one mind being verily of the voidness and without any foundation, one's mind is likewise as vacuous as the sky. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Being of the voidness, and thus not to be conceived as having beginning or ending, self-born wisdom has in reality been shining forever, like the sun's essentiality, itself unborn. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Divine wisdom is undoubtedly indestructible, unbreakable, like the ever-flowing current of a river. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Being merely a flux of instability, like the air of the firmament, objective appearances are without power to fascinate and fetter. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. All appearances are verily one's own concepts, self-conceived in the mind, like reflections seen in a mirror. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Arising of themselves, and being naturally free like the clouds in the sky, all external appearances verily fade away into their respective places. To know this be so or not, look within thine own mind. The Dharma being nowhere save in the mind, there is no other place of meditation than the mind. The Dharma being nowhere save in the mind, there is no other doctrine to be taught or practiced elsewhere. The Dharma being nowhere save in the mind, there is no other place of truth for the observance of a vow. The Dharma being nowhere save in the mind, there is no Dharma elsewhere whereby liberation may be attained. Again and again, look within thine own mind. When looking outwards into the vacuity of space, there is no place to be found where the mind is shining. When looking inwards into one's own mind in search of the shining, there is to be found no thing that shines. One's own mind is transparent, without quality. Being of the clear light of the voidness, one's own mind is of the Dharmakaya, and being void of quality, it is comparable to a cloudless sky. It is not a multiplicity, and it is omniscient. Very great indeed is the difference between knowing and not knowing the import of these teachings. The self-originated clear light, eternally unborn, is a parentless babe of wisdom. Wondrous is this. Being non-created, it is natural wisdom. Wondrous is this. Not having known birth, it knows not death. Wondrous is this. Although it is total reality, there is no perceiver of it. Wondrous is this. Although wandering in the samsara, it remains undefiled by evil. Wondrous is this. Although seeing the Buddha, it remains unallied to good. Wondrous is this. Although possessed by all beings, it is not recognized. Wondrous is this. Through not knowing the fruit of this yoga, they seek other fruit. Wondrous is this. Although the clear light of reality shines within one's own mind, the multitude look for it elsewhere. Wondrous is this. So that's a reading from a Tibetan text that is attributed to Padmasambhava. So it's something that's quite a bit outside of our Theravada tradition, but it illustrates the central preoccupation of all schools of Buddhism is the nature of mind. Knowing and exploring, understanding the nature of one's own mind is the essence of the path. As this text says it in one section again and again, look within thine own mind. I think this was a central theme of most of Buddhist thought, is the nature of mind. And it's not even confined strictly to Buddhism, but I think it was a preoccupation of Indian civilization. When I look at the two great contemporary, very precocious civilizations of the Greeks, the Hellenes, and the Indians, both very brilliant civilizations, but quite different in character. The Greeks were extroverts and the Indians were introverts in their concerns and preoccupations. The nature of the world and phenomena was what concerned Greek thought primarily, whereas India, it was always what is mind. And I think it starts from a place of profound wisdom to even ask the question in a deep way, because really mind is all that we ever experience. We only know our own mind, ever. The outer world that we experience is a reflection through the sense organs of data in terms of wavelengths of light or vibrations in the air, molecules of scent. And this is all that we get from the outer universe, is these kind of limited signals. And we experience this through the faculty of perception as a reality, as a external appearance, in the words of this text, a phenomena, external phenomena. But this is all entirely enclosed within our own mind. It's a product, a creation of our mind. The Zen tradition, too, is concerned with this question and tries to approach it, at least in a large part, through these kind of paradoxical koans that force you beyond the confines of narrow logic. In this particular context, I think the koan, what was your face before you were born? Or another variant of that is, what was your original face before your parents were born? What is your essential nature? And as this text we just looked at says, that this mind is ever present, immediate in the experience of beings, of all beings, but beings don't recognize it. Wonders is this. It's the most immediate, intimate reality. It's right here, right now, but we don't know what it is, or we don't have a clear understanding. It's the habit or tendency of beings to reverse their priorities, reverse reality, and see the external appearances as essential and real and substantial, and the mind as something secondary. And this is, in the terms of the Dhammapada, this is very much putting the cart before the horse, or the cart before the bullock. So the first verse of the Dhammapada is that mind is the forerunner, mind is the chief, just as the bullock comes before the cart. And yet mind is a void nature. And this also we see in this Tibetan text, again and again, the mind like the empty sky, the vacuous mind, the mind without color, without substance. When we're trying to understand the nature of mind, one conceptual trap to avoid is that because we are forced by the nature of our human language, we're forced to use a noun to say mind or consciousness or even the knowing. Or we use a noun or a noun phrase to describe mind. It tends to set up an implication that there is something that we're talking about. And this is true not only in English. I mean, we have Pali, Chitta, and words in every language. There'll be some noun for speaking about mind, but it's not a thing. There's no substance to it. You can't say how much it weighs or where it's located or what color it is or anything of that sort. There's just this experience, this knowing. In the Theravada tradition, or one approach within the Theravada tradition is that of Abhidhamma, which is a method of exhaustive analysis to try and gain an understanding of these inner realities by looking at the way it works and the functionality and the relationship between factors and so on in a very methodical, systematic, and exhaustive way. And one of the first categorizations of Abhidhamma is to divide all of reality into four irreducibles, four fundamental ontological realities. There's Citta, Cetasika, Kaya, and Nibbana. Kaya being body, materiality, physicality. Nibbana being the unconditioned, and that leaves the two aspects of mind, Citta and Cetasika. And of these, Citta is mind in its absolute essence. It's the subjective quality, it's the knowing. And just as the Tibetan text says that it wanders in samsara but knows not evil, it meets the Buddha but knows not good. The Citta is so absolutely fundamentally simple and uncompounded that really nothing affects it. It cannot be defiled nor can it be purified. It just is what it is. It just knows. And again, be cautious listening to my language because I'm using nouns. I'm saying it. There's no it involved really, but it's difficult to speak of without falling into that kind of trap. The other side of mind is Cetasika. This is all the busyness and processing of mind, and it includes perception, our experience of the outer world, it includes feelings, and it includes all kinds of thought formations. These are Cetasikas. And from the point of view of Citta, they're external. But both sides are empty, void, without substance. And when we practice meditation, we're practicing a a looking inwards, a looking within thine own mind. And there are innumerable approaches and ways of doing this. Two broad categorizations to make, just staying within the Theravada. There is the Burmese approach. In Burma, they've developed various techniques of Vipassana, and the emphasis is on knowing the objective qualities, the Chittasikas. So one makes an effort to methodically observe each Chittasika as it arises in the mind, whether it's a thought or a emotion or a sensation. And that approach goes very well with the Abhidhamma, and we see that in Burma as the culture that's most emphasized Vipassana has also emphasized Abhidhamma. The Thai forest tradition takes another approach, and I'm thinking primarily of the influence of Ajahn Mun. The approach is to know the Chitta, to be centered in the Chitta, to rest in the Chitta. Mahabua calls it your true home. You're going home. You find your home. He uses that kind of language. And when you're centered in the knowing mind, then everything unfolds as it will, and it's all clear, and the Chitta is not affected by it. And the Chitta is not disturbed. It's not fascinated by beautiful things. It's not terrified of frightening things. It just is. It just knows these things as phenomena. And it's just its natural state. It's not a some kind of esoteric development. It's just Chitta resting in its natural state. It's like this. And these two approaches that I'm calling for brevity's sake or for reference, I'm calling them the Burmese and the Thai approach. In the end, they amount to the same thing when they're done well. When they're done to some degree of perfection, then they're the same thing. Because if you are clearly seeing all the Chittasikas, you have to be centered in the Chitta to be able to do that. Likewise, if you're centered in the Chitta, you'll clearly observe all the Chittasikas without being disturbed. So you're doing the same thing. It's really just a matter of approach and language and description. And there's a great paradox involved in knowing the Chitta, because being that the Chitta is quintessentially subjective, it's just a pure knowing, there's no way it can be known as an object. You cannot know the Chitta objectively from the outside, as it were. The Chitta is that which knows. It's like trying to see your own face. You can look in the mirror and see a reflection of your face, but that's not your face. That's a reflection of your face. So you can look in the mind and try and see the Chitta, but all you'll see is an idea of the Chitta or an image of the Chitta. But what's doing the looking? So another Zen koan is the man searching the empty house, looking for the owner and not finding him. The house is completely empty, so who's doing the looking? So you won't understand the nature of mind ultimately by rationalizing it, by thinking about it or trying to figure it out or reading endless books. No, it has to be found within. And The difficulty in understanding it is not because of its complication, but because of its simplicity. There's really nothing to get a handle on. If it was complicated, then we could write a formula or an algorithm and describe it. You know, it would be approachable. Complicated things are easier than simple things. When something is absolutely, quintessentially, ultimately simple, there's nothing to hook on, nowhere to hook on to it with logic or thought or description. It is really a great mystery that mind is really all that we experience, but we don't know its nature. So we can use some of these metaphors to try and get a glimpse. One of the favorites of the Tibetan tradition is the blue sky, the clear blue sky. The mind is like the clear blue sky. And when the mind is defiled, then it's like a cloudy sky. But the blue sky is still there behind the clouds. You're just not aware of it. In the Pali Suttas, a favorite metaphor is a clear pool of water, a still clear pool of water. That the water is transparent, and one can look in the water and see the pebbles at the bottom and fish swimming to and fro. And the vision is not obstructed in any way by the water. That's like the clear lucidity of the mind. And the various defilements that obscure the mind are likened to disturbances in the water. Desire is like colored dye thrown into the water, pretty to look at, but you can't see to the bottom. Anger is like the water is boiling. Right? Sloth and torpor is like scum growing on top of the water. And skeptical doubt is like the water is muddy. And anxiety is like the water is whipped up by the wind. But the essential nature of the water, in any case, is unchanged. It's still water. But it can be hidden from us by these various intrusions. As a practical matter of practice, it's essential to try and differentiate the distinction for yourself internally between citta and citasika, between the knowing and the known. And really, when that distinction is clear, then everything becomes clear. Things sort themselves out quite nicely. What we do endlessly is we confuse these aspects of mind, and we identify with the citasikas, and we get carried away by our mental states, and it can lead us into all kinds of foolishness, and can lead us even into destruction by taking the mental states as something substantial. Being centered in the citta is like being inside of a warm cabin when there's a blizzard and a storm going on outside. You can see the weather and the storm and the snow blowing, but you're not affected by it. Identifying with the Chitasika is like going outside into the storm to the teeth of the wind. And always be careful when approaching these questions with your conceptualizations. Don't try and box the knowing, box the vichitta in concepts, because that can never succeed. It's beyond all conceptualization. Because it's absolutely void, vacuous, clear, has no substance of its own nature. There's the Zen description of the mind as a mirror set up in a high place that brilliantly illuminates the 10,000 things, but nothing is reflected in the face of the mirror thereby. Another metaphor. The empty mirror, the empty shining mirror. So in some way, we could say that you can't really know the knowing, but you can be the knowing. Attempting to know the knowing is like the impossible conundrum. There's a symbol from Western Hermeticism of it's an alchemical symbol of the Ouroboros. It's a snake in a circle biting its own tail. Imagine that the snake eating itself from the tail, and what happens when it takes the very last bite. This is a symbol of knowing the mind. Now, some of you will have heard me relate this anecdote before. At one time I was attending a talk given by a Tibetan Rinpoche, and it was a very interesting talk. And at one point he started touching on the subject of Dzogchen, although that wasn't the main theme of the talk. And he said that the exercise should be to observe clearly the knowing mind. And I didn't think at the time when there was a public question and answer, I didn't think it would be polite or politic for me as a Theravada monk to ask the question I wanted to ask. I thought it might come across as challenging or rude, which wasn't my intention. But I waited till after I got him aside privately, and I asked him, you said in the talk that you told people to observe the knowing mind. Do you think that's even possible? And he kind of went around the question a bit, back and forth, and then in the end he said, well, actually, no, it's not. But it's a really good exercise to try. So we want to approach a deeper understanding of this question. You don't get it by thinking or rationalization, but by going inwards. Now, search within thine own mind.
Antamayam Tamakataya Sadhu Kalam Dharamase Sadhu Sadhu